Hello there. I'm back to reading a nice story for you. This is a short story named His Wedded Wife, written by Rudyard Kipling, and is part of his book, Plain Tales from the Hills. The background of this story is in the northern hill stations and etc. of northern India. And this is the time of the colonial rule in India, when the English were ruling India, and English boys would join the army, in British army, and they would be given a posting in India, and they will sail from wherever, London, Liverpool, wherever, to Bombay, and then take the train to Delhi and Shimla or wherever. Mostly these British officers were stationed in the cool places in the north, in the hilly stations. That's why this book is called Plain Tales from the Hills. So this is a story titled His Wedded Wife. And it starts with a small quotation. It says, "Cry murder in the marketplace, and each will turn upon his neighbor with anxious eyes that ask, Art thou the man? We hunted Cain some centuries ago across the world, that bred the fear our own misdeeds maintain today." So the story starts. Shakespeare says something about worms, or maybe it is about gnats or beetles. And he says that the worm will turn if you tread on it too severely. The safest plan is never to tread on a worm, not even on the last new subaltern from home, with his buttoned hardly out of their tissue paper and the red of sappy English beef in his cheeks. Now this refers to subaltern. Subaltern is a very junior officer in the British Army. Maybe he's just a cadet who has just been enrolled after this in training. So the safest plan is never to tread on a worm, not even on the last new subaltern from home. So he's comparing a new subaltern, the young boy who has just joined the army and has been posted to India and has arrived here. So the writer is comparing that subaltern to the worm. And the subaltern he is describing has his uniform with the buttons hardly out of their tissue paper. The buttons would be wrapped in tissue paper and they would just have been sewn on to the uniform. And the red of sappy English beef in his cheeks. So the subaltern has just come and is still fresh and his cheeks are red. This is a story of the worm that turned. For the sake of brevity, we will call this subaltern, his name is Henry Augustus Ramsay Faizane. So instead of calling the full name Henry Augustus Ramsay Faizane, we'll refer to him as the worm. Though he really was an exceedingly pretty boy, without a hair on his face and with a waist like a girl's. So this was a boy hardly just out of his teens or whatever. He didn't even have a hair on his face. And he was so thin, his waist was like a girl's. when he came out in the second shikaris and was made unhappy in several ways. I'll read it again. This is the story of the worm that turned. For the sake of brevity, we will call Henry Augustus Ramsay Faizan the worm, though he really was an exceedingly pretty boy, without a hair on his face and with a waist like a girl's, when he came out to the second shikaris and was made unhappy in several ways. The shikaris are a high caste regiment, and you must be able to do things well, play a banjo, or ride more than a little, or sing or act to get on with them. So the shikaris needed some talent. The worm did nothing except fall off his pony and knock chips out of the gatepost with his trap. So that was his achievement. Even that became monotonous after a little time. He objected to whist. Whist is a game of cards which Englishmen love to play. He objected to whist, cut the cloth at billiards. So the billiard table is covered with a cloth, and this boy, the worm, cut that while playing, sang out of tune. His singing would be out of tune. Kept very much to himself and wrote to his mama and sisters at home. 4 of these 5 things were vices which the shikaris objected to and set themselves to eradicate. So what all did he do? The vices mean bad habits. He did not like to play whist. He objected to it, playing cards. He did not know how to play billiards or billiards, and while playing billiards, he tore the cloth on the table. He sang out of tune. He kept to himself. He was not companionable. He could not be in company. He liked himself. And he wrote to his mama and sisters very often. So these were the 5 vices, and these vices were objected to by the shikaris, the regiment or group to which he was posted. That's the name of the regiment. So the shikaris, the other members of the regiment, took it upon themselves to eradicate these vices, the bad habits of this worm. Everyone knows how subalterns are. By brother subalterns, softened and not permitted to be ferocious. It is good and wholesome and does no one any harm, unless tempers are lost, and then there is trouble. There was a man once. The shikaris shikared the worm very much, and he bore everything without winking. He was so good and so anxious to learn, and flushed so pink that his education was cut short, and he was left to his own devices by everyone except the senior subaltern. Senior subaltern is this boss in charge of the entire troop, by the senior subaltern, who continued to make life a burden to the worm. The senior subaltern meant no harm, but his shaft was coarse and he didn't quite understand where to stop. So he would scold this worm, and he would annoy him, and he would not know when to stop. What he spoke was quite coarse, not elegant language. He had been waiting too long for his company, and that always sours a man. Also, he was in love, which made him worse. One day, after he had borrowed the worm's trap for a lady who never existed. So, trap is the small horse-drawn vehicle, and that is what has happened in the first paragraph. This worm came with his trap, and he broke the gate, and that is when, and then he fell down. So this subaltern borrowed the trap mm, to the, one day he had borrowed the worm's trap for a lady who never existed, and he had used it himself all the afternoon, and had sent a note to the worm purporting to come from the lady, and was telling the mess all about it. The worm rose in his place and said, in his quiet, ladylike voice, "That was a very pretty sell, but I'll lay you a month's pay to a month's pay when you get your step, that I work a sell on you that you'll remember for the rest of your days, and the regiment after you when you are dead or broke." So this worm stood up. They were at the mess, means they were all eating, when this subaltern was boasting about how he had borrowed the trap from the worm, and saying that he wanted it for his girlfriend. There was no such girlfriend; she didn't exist. And the subaltern had used it all afternoon for himself, and he was boasting about it in the mess. So at that time, the worm rose in his seat and said, in his quiet, ladylike voice, "That was a very pretty sell, but I will bet you a month's pay. I'll lay you a month's pay." This is the English they used to speak in those days. It's about 100 years or 150 years ago in India, amongst the English English army folk. So I will lay you a month's pay, lay a bet on you of I'll give you a month's pay, and you have 1 month's pay, one against the other. When you get your step, that I work a sell on you, and you will remember that for the rest of your days, and the regiment after you when you are dead or broke. The worm wasn't angry in the least, and the rest of the mess shouted. Then the senior subaltern looked at the worm from the boots upwards and down again and said, "Done, baby," means I agree, I accept your bet. The worm held the rest of the mess to witness that the bet had been taken, and retired into a book with a sweet smile. So the uh, entire company was at the mess, at the table, and this worm had told that, okay, I'll bet you 1 month's pay to your 1 month's pay, that I'll make you remember this by something I'll do, which you will never forget, and your regiment will remember for the rest of its life. And the bet was accepted. 2 months passed, and the senior subaltern still educated the worm. He was continuing to teach the worm, no, you shouldn't do that, you should do like this is how you should do, and all that. So the worm began to move about a little more as the hot weather came on. I have said that the senior subaltern was in love. The curious thing is that a girl was in love with the senior subaltern. Though the colonel said awful things, and the majors snorted, and the married captains looked unutterable wisdom, and the juniors scoffed, those two were engaged. So in spite of all the comments and sniggers of all the other people, the subaltern got engaged to that girl. The senior subaltern was Yeah, the senior subaltern was so pleased with getting his company and his acceptance at the same time that he forgot to bother the woman. The girl was a pretty girl and had money of her own. She does not come into this story at all. One night, at the beginning of the hot weather, all the mess, except the one who had gone to his own room to write home letters, were sitting on the platform outside the mess house. The band had finished playing, but no one wanted to go in. So you'll realize that there was a mess house, and this group was staying in that, and they had dinner there, and the band would play while they had food served and they ate. Now, if dinner was over, the band had stopped playing and everything was closed, and they were outside the mess house relaxing. One night, at the beginning of the hot weather, all the mess, except the worm had gone to his own room to write letters to his own. All the rest were sitting on the platform outside of the mess. The band had finished playing, but no one wanted to go in. This is in India, so it is hot weather. But the captain's wives were there also, and the captain's wives were there also. The folly of a man in love is unlimited. So you get these things. There is a subaltern, the senior subaltern, the captain, the colonel. These are all ranks given to various officers in the army as they become more experienced and promoted to higher ranks. And the captain's wives were also there. The folly of a man in love is unlimited. The senior subaltern had been holding forth on the merits of the girl he was engaged to, and the ladies were purring approval, while the men yawned, when there was a rustle of skirts in the dark, and a tired, faint voice lifted itself. "Where's my husband?" that tired little voice asked. I do not wish in the least to reflect on the morality of the shikaris, but it is on record that 4 men jumped up as if they had been shot. 3 of them were married men. Perhaps they were afraid that their wives had come from home without their knowledge. The 4th said that he had acted on the impulse of the moment. He explained this afterwards. Then the voice cried, "Oh, Lionel, Lionel, oh, Lionel." Lionel was the senior subaltern's name. A woman came into the little circle of light by the candles. A woman came into the little circle of light by the candles on the peg tables, stretching out her hands to the dark where the senior subaltern was, and sobbing. We rose to our feet, feeling that things were going to happen, and ready to believe. It's a bit difficult. Print is very small. We rose to our feet, feeling that things were going to happen, and ready to believe the worst. In this bad, small world of ours, one knows so little of the life of the next man, which, after all, is entirely his own concern, that one is not surprised when a crash comes. Anything might turn up any day for anyone. Perhaps the senior subaltern had been trapped in his youth. Men are crippled that way occasionally. We didn't know, we wanted to hear, and the captain's wives were as anxious as we were. If he had been trapped, he was to be excused. For the woman from nowhere in the dusty shoes and grey travelling dress was very lovely, with black hair and great eyes full of tears. She was tall with a fine figure, and her voice had a running sob in its pitiful tear. As soon as his senior subaltern stood up, she threw her arms around his neck and called him my darling, and said she could not bear waiting alone in England. And his letters were so short and so cold, and she was his to the end of the world, and would he forgive her? This did not sound quite like a lady's way of speaking. It was too demonstrative. Things seemed
Also, sir, armrest.
things seemed black indeed, and the captain's wives
Was armrest to put my hand.
things seemed black indeed, and the captain's wives peered under their eyebrows at the senior subaltern, and the colonel's face set like the day of judgment, framed in grey bristles, and no one spoke for a while. Next, the colonel said very shortly, "Well, sir," it was a question, and the woman sobbed afresh. The senior subaltern was half choked with the arms round his neck, but he gasped out, "It's a damned lie. I never had a wife in my life." So he said, "I'd never had a wife in my life, and this is a damn lie." "Don't swear," said the colonel. "Come into the mess. We must sift this clear somehow." And he sighed to himself, for he believed in his shikaris. We trooped into the anteroom under the full lights, and there saw how beautiful the woman was. She stood up in the middle of us all, sometimes choking with crying, then hard and proud, and then holding out her arms to the senior subaltern. It was like the fourth act of a tragedy. She told us how the senior subaltern had married her when he was home on leave 18 months ago, and she seemed to know all that he knew, and more too, of his people and his past life. He was white and ashy grey, trying now and again to break into the torrent of her words, and we, noting how lovely she was and what a criminal he looked, esteemed him a beast of the worst kind. We felt sorry for him, though. I shall never forget the indictment of the senior subaltern by the wife, nor will he. It was so sudden, rushing out of the dark, unannounced, into our dull lives. The captain's wife stood back, but their eyes were alight, and you could see that they had already convicted and sentenced the senior subaltern. The colonel seemed 5 years older. One major was shading his eyes with his hand and watching the woman from underneath it. Another was chewing his mustache, and smiling quietly as if he were witnessing a play. Full in the open space in the center, by the whist tables, the senior subaltern's terrier was hunting for flies. I remember all this so clearly, as though a photograph were in my hand. I remember the look of horror on the senior subaltern's face. It was rather like seeing a man hanged, but much more interesting. Finally, the woman wound up by saying that the senior subaltern carried a double FM in tattoo on his left shoulder. We all knew that, and to our innocent minds, it seemed to clinch the matter. That was adequate proof that she was his wife. But one of the bachelor majors said very politely, I presume that your marriage certificate would be more to the purpose. So, one of the bachelor majors said, I suppose your marriage certificate would be more relevant. That roused the woman. She stood up and sneered sen- at the senior subaltern for a cur. She called him a dog and abused the major and the colonel and all the rest. Then she wept, and then she pulled a paper from her breast, saying imperially, take that and let my husband, my lawfully wedded husband, read it aloud if he dare. There was a hush, and the men looked into each other's eyes as the senior subaltern came forward in a dazed and dizzy way and took the paper. We were wondering, as we stared, whether there was anything against any one of us that night, which might turn up later. The senior subaltern's throat was dry, but as he ran his eye over the paper, he broke out into a hoarse cackle of relief and said to the woman, you young blackguard. But the woman had fled through a door, and on the paper was written, this is to certify that I, the worm, have paid in full my debts to the senior subaltern, and further, that the senior subaltern is my debtor by agreement on 23rd February, as by the mess attested, to the extent of 1 month's captain's pay in the lawful currency of the Indian Empire. So this was a trick played by the worm, and it said that that paper which the woman extended and the subaltern took said the words that this is to certify that the subaltern has settled all his dues to the senior, and the senior owed to the worm 1 month's pay in the lawful currency of India. Then a deputation set off, and the woman had run away, vanished. A deputation set off for the worm's quarters and found him betwixt and between, unlacing his stays, with the hat, wig, and serge dress on the bed. He came over as he was, and the shikaris shouted till the gunner's mess sent over to know if they might have a share in the fun. I think we were all, except the colonel and the senior subaltern, a little disappointed that the scandal had come to nothing. But that is human nature. There could be no two words about the woman's acting. It leaned as near to a nasty tragedy as anything this side of a joke can be. It was a beautiful acting by that woman. When most of the subalterns sat upon him with sofa cushions to find out why he had not said that acting was his strong point, he answered very quietly, I don't think you ever asked me. I used to act at home with my sisters. But no acting with girls could account for the worm's display that night. Personally, I think it was in bad taste, besides being dangerous. There is no sort of use in playing with fire, even for fun. So what had happened was that the worm had dressed up as the woman and brought the paper and created this big drama and vanished. The shikaris made him president of the regimental dramatic circle, and when the senior subaltern paid up his debt, which he did at once, the worms sank the money to scenery and dresses. He was a good one, and the shikaris are proud of him. The only drawback is that he has been christened Mrs. Senior Subaltern, and as there are now two Mrs. Senior Subalterns in the section, in the station, this is sometimes confusing to strangers. Later on, I'll tell you a case of something like this. But for today, that is it. That's a really humorous story in the.
What is subaltern?
Subaltern is a junior, like a sepoy or a just enrolled guy. What will it be called?
A foot soldier.
Soldier, and then senior subaltern, then captain, then colonel, and all that. So he had been harassing this boy, the worm. The boy, he looked very thin like a girl. He had just put on his costume and come here in the midst and is spoken in a female voice and created such a confusion there. They all had big fun for a whole day, whole night. And the head of that entire regiment, he said, "What is happening? I think we all want to join your fun." Very
interesting.
very nice
It
story.
takes you back, right?
Yeah.
It takes you back to
Yes.
those days.
That was a very nice story.
India during the Victorian era.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, sorry.
Nice.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Bye.